Hello and welcome to Comics Over Time. This season, which we're calling Murdock and Marvel, a history of Marvel Comics starring Daredevil, is our most ambitious project yet. Our plan is to look at the state of the comic book industry during a particular year, and then to examine in detail the major ways that Marvel Comics in particular evolved during that year. We'll look at who was creating comics, what new characters or storylines were introduced, and which comics either debuted or ended. After that, we'll get down to business, take out our stack of Daredevil comics, and look at what our old friend, the Man Without Fear, was up to during that same time. We're glad you've joined us. My name is Dwayne, and with me, as always, my good buddy Dan. Dan, we are back for another week.
Absolutely. So it's going to be an interesting one. We're starting to see what happens when two sort of like kaiju-sized comic book companies take to warring against each other with essentially the world of comic books as their battleground. And things are starting to get a little bit scary for some of the smaller companies and for, in fact, the distributors and even the comic shops. But there's a lot of comic books coming out this year. Almost all of them Marvel and DC.
All right, sounds like 1988 is going to be a very interesting year, so why don't we jump in and let's talk about it. The year in comics. All right, it's 1988. We have two giant kaijus kind of running the show. One of them presumably is DC, which is where we normally start when we're talking about the year in comics. So, Dan, what was DC doing, and what was the impact across the rest of the comic book industry?
So we'll talk about some of that when we get more into what we normally talk about with industry trends and stuff like that. But just keep in mind that throughout this year, DC, as well as Marvel when we get to them, are just pumping out new formats and new comics and new price points. And DC especially is really being very aggressive at having prestige format books that are higher priced and regular format books and books that are a little bit more expensive because they've got better paper and all of this. And there's kind of this wide swath, with the one exception that DC, for the most part, is not really doing much to try and get out to the other markets the way Marvel is. DC, in a lot of ways, is just straight ahead for that sort of superhero young male audience that has been sort of the traditional comic book target. And so it's Superman's anniversary, and they're busy, though, celebrating that. He turned 50 this year, so 1938 to 1988. Technically, we normally think 1937, but they decided to go with this as the celebration year. So DC and the culture at large are celebrating. We have things like a Big Time magazine article that talked about how Superman had changed in the new Man of Steel series. This article actually irritated John Byrne, who believed that because Time and DC were owned by the same company, they should have gotten better coverage, and maybe some of the questions that they asked about the changes he'd made should have been softened. So that led him actually to eventually leave doing Superman a little bit after. DC threw a big birthday party in New York, invited people in to have cake and everything else. A number of the DC sort of luminaries were there. They charged, I think it was like $10-12 for people to get in. So,
oh my goodness!
They threw a birthday party and charged admission, as the companies will do. So, nonetheless, some interesting things going on. It was kind of cool that, again, we see Superman highlighted in the culture. A lot of places back in Cleveland and the like did some cool stuff to remember not only Superman, but Siegel and Schuster. So that was neat. DC themselves added a number of things called bonus books to their comics this year. For about 2 years they had these. And essentially it was like another comic book, a 16-page comic book, just sort of stapled in the middle of your comic. So you would be going around reading your comic, and when you get to the middle of it, there's another cover. It's not like a shiny cover. It would be just regular page. but you get a cover, and then you get 14 pages of story and a back cover, and then you'd return to your comic book.
Really?
And, yeah, it's kind of crazy. So, in any case, these were out there for a while. I don't know if they were particularly successful, but I remember them being interesting. They usually tied in at least somewhat to the actual comic you were reading, like they had some relation to them, but not always. And the idea was that it would give them a chance to try out new stories, new characters, and then new creators. So lots of
So
people.
did they end up charging more for those comics then too?
Excellent question. Actually, they didn't. They left the price the same, and it was actually
Really?
it is the proverbial free lunch. It was actually something where they didn't reduce the pages of the regular book. They just added this in and essentially considered it advertising, which I thought was pretty cool.
No, that is great because I think some of the issues sometimes now lately it seems like it's like, oh, I wasn't expecting that my comic book that is normally $5 is now suddenly $10 because they've decided to throw a bunch more pages in here that I have no control over.
Or the comic you're used to having 20 pages of or 22 pages of Moon Knight suddenly has 15 pages of Moon Knight and an Iron Fist story in the back or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So no, this that was actually not the case. It was another big year for DC too, because they published two of the more notable series of the entire sort of later half of the decade this year. One of them was called The Killing Joke, was written by Alan Moore, drawn by Bryan, both of whom are some of my favorite creators. It was a story that was in a premium format. It was well hyped up. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies and was probably the highest selling comic of that year and maybe a couple of years around it. It is also, as far as I'm concerned, the worst comic in the history of the comic medium.
Really?
I'm on record hating Killing Joke worse than any other comic ever made.
So why is that then?
Well, I had a bit of a crush on Barbara Gordon, who is the Batgirl in the DC universe, the original Batgirl. There have been a few since, but she debuted back in the 60s after first appearing on the TV show, and then sort of was used sporadically by DC over the next 15 or 20 years. They didn't really exactly know what to do with her. And Alan Moore was asked to write a Batman story. And he said, okay, but, I'm going to do it my way or whatever. And he put in this proposal for a story. And according to him now, if you read some of the things he said since, he himself doesn't like the story. He thinks that it's actually sort of a tragic mistake and something that he regrets doing. But he's like, I put in a story where the Joker comes along and essentially shoots and paralyzes Barbara Gordon, and then strips her naked, takes pictures of her, kidnaps and tortures her father while making him look at pictures of his daughter who has been freshly mutilated by the Joker.
Whoa.
And the idea behind this is the Joker has this philosophy that the reason why he went bad, and we get a little bit of the Joker origin in here, is that he was just a guy who was a criminal, and he had one bad day where he happened to come up against the Batman, fall into that vat of chemicals at the Acme factory, and then that turned him into the Joker. And so he's like, because of this, I believe any even good person, any good man can be turned into a monster, can be turned crazy by one bad day. And so he sets out to use Commissioner Gordon as his example by doing so many horrible things to him, torturing him, potentially all sorts. There's even some implications that he did some weird sexual things to him, whatever. That all of this would be done to drive him insane, to prove that the Joker is correct in his theory that any person can be just one bad day away from being a psycho criminal.
Wow.
And it is, I mean, the thing I've always had is a something can't be the worst, right? You can't have the worst movie ever made, be like Plan 9 from outer space or whatever. Because the people who made that were not really very good at making movies. You know, it has to be something like the Flintstones, where you've got a massively good cast and a big budget, and you still manage to make something terrible, right? This is two of the best creators in comics at the top of their game, given all of the best production capabilities of the DC Comics publishing empire, and they made an absolute piece of steaming trash. Now, I will say that you'll also notice that it wins the Eisner for like 2 or 3 things this year. So when it first comes out, it is lauded. There's probably a number of people on this podcast listening who are ready to now fight me about the fact that Killing Joke is one of the greatest Batman stories ever told. I get that, and I'm fine with that. I understand that there are things about it that are very interesting in terms of that idea of what it did to sort of inform the Joker's madness and everything like this. I still just don't like it, because it is deeply troubling in terms of the violence and the misogyny and the fact that they basically took out one of my favorite characters. Because after this, Barbara Gordon spends the next 20 years in a wheelchair. Now, they do use her in fantastic ways. She becomes a character called Oracle, who's essentially the man in the chair for most of the DC universe. You know, like Peter Parker's man in the chair in the comic or in the movies and stuff. And Oracle's a really cool character, but still, it was unfortunate. So this was a tough one for me. That same year, they then also had Jim Starlin take over on Batman and ask him to do a story. And he decides to do a story called A Death in the Family. A Death in the Family is one where, again, the Joker threatens a member of the Batman family. And in this case, it's a matter of somehow or another the new Robin, Jason Todd, who's taken over from Dick Grayson as Robin now that he's graduated to be Nightwing.
Yeah.
Is somehow or another in a confrontation with the Joker. It looks like the Joker's going to kill him, and the surprise twist is that they set up an 800 number where fans can call in, and depending on whether fans say yay or nay, either the Joker will kill Jason Todd or the Joker will not kill Jason Todd. And they gave like a 36-hour window. And at the end of that 36-hour window, there was something like 10,000 people who'd paid their 50 cents to call in on this. And by a vote of, I think it was like 50 to 70 votes, 72 sticks in my head for some reason, Jason Todd was given the thumbs down. And the next issue of the comic, the Joker kills him. And so in 1988, you have 2 of Batman's sort of young companions brutally either murdered or crippled by the Joker. Which is a harsh year for Batman.
Yeah.
And so I had a lot of trouble with this. You know, the book itself, again, young Mike Mignola doing the art. Art was really, really interesting. I loved the covers for these books. But in the end, it was brutal. And so outside of these, which I don't want to go on about too far, I think I've made my opinions known. Feel free, everybody, to send me a note on how wrong I am about this. But there were some other DC books that came out. V for Vendetta, another Alan Moore book, came out this year. I really liked V for Vendetta. It was about essentially an alternate Earth, almost Britain, where you've got a someone who's attempting to be a terrorist to bring down the government and the like. V for Vendetta is dark. It was started previously in another book by Moore, and then he finishes it now. We had Black Orchid #1, which was the first American comic book written by Neil Gaiman, which we would have been celebrating that a lot more if it hadn't been for all the stuff that's happening right now with Neil Gaiman. But that's something I don't know enough about to get into too far, but I will say that it seems like the respect that everybody's held Gaiman in for a long time in the comic industry is quickly vanishing with some of the stuff going on right now. And then we have a third of our big British imports. Grant Morrison actually writes his first American book as well, something called Animal Man, which is one of the craziest and most interesting books of the late 80s, early 90s. And it's essentially about a comic book character who begins to realize he's a comic book character.
Oh, goodness.
Mm-hmm. It is very meta. Almost everything that Grant Morrison does as he moves forward has that sort of meta kind of feel to it. But this is sort of where he started.
Gotcha.
So,
all right.
But so DC's doing, besides that, just a bunch of comics, miniseries, other series, etc., sort of flooding the zone with new product and making it hard for a lot of other stuff to come out. Because of that, when I was looking to find out what was new in terms of third-party publishers and the like, very little out there. We had Maze Agency, which is a mystery comic that I really liked, but a couple of mystery event kind of detectives, investigators type thing. The interesting thing is that they're almost like an Agatha Christie mystery, where all of the clues you need are set out for you in the actual comic, and then you can try and solve it with them or before them or whatever. So that was fun. The Tick debuted this year. If you've ever seen the TV show, the animated show of the Tick, or even the live action Tick, this was the comic book that's based on. That started this year. We had some new licensed properties. Dark Horse started publishing Aliens and Godzilla books. Aliens especially was really popular. This was one of the better selling books of the year.
Yeah. It's I was going to say, I think I've seen, over the years, I've seen lots of different Aliens books.
Yes. Yep. Absolutely. A lot of fans of that out there. We also, as far as new stuff, had Kings in Disguise by Jim Vance and Dan Burr. This is actually an interesting one because it feels almost more like a documentary type book. It is set in the 1930s. It deals with labor and social issues, and it kind of follows a 13-year-old kid who is trying to make his way in Depression America, kind of just riding along the rails, being a tramp, that sort of stuff. Highly celebrated. We're going to see that it wins a bunch of the Eisners this year. And it sort of just epitomized the sort of stuff that wasn't getting done anywhere else, because DC and Marvel are sort of consolidating on their universe comics more, and we're seeing fewer of these types of sort of just regular drama types of books being done. Other than that, there was also one other one that we can talk about. We'll see in industry trends that there's a lot going on in terms of censorship and government interference with comics and things like that. Part of that was that a couple of years ago, DC decided to do a rating system. And Howard Chaykin, in response to this, decided to make what he calls a comic that is appalling and offensive and funny. And he basically said, I'm going to make a comic that will offend everybody. At least something.
Oh, God.
At least something in Black Kiss, which is essentially sort of like a film noir and a porno crossed together, will offend just about anybody.
Yeah.
This would have gotten an X or a triple X rating in pretty much any system that could have been devised. And astonishingly, it sold a ton of copies. There are some people who say that it was, after maybe Aliens, the second highest selling independent book of the year. So it is crazy stuff. I have read it, and I'm going to tell you, it is not surprising that it got in trouble as much as it did. They tried to send it over to Britain, and the British police actually stopped it and identified it as what they called unacceptable in any format, according to a story from Amazing Heroes back in the day. So it is something that was sold with like one of those black bags and stuff like this to protect kids from seeing it and all that. So it was interesting. But Howard Chaykin is a very odd dude. He is very much somebody who likes to sort of press buttons, and he actually was very upset at the way that they were looking at doing the rating stuff, and decided to make a statement on it, and then that is what he did. So
Right.
outside of that, we had the Superboy TV show debut this year. Oddly, one show I've never watched. I've never really watched the Superman TV show or Superboy TV show at all. It came out when I was probably, at this point I would have been like 18 years old. So this was almost more like a kids type of show, and it sort of missed me in that. And then on a sad note, we do have a couple of folks who have Marvel connections that I'll want to mention that passed away this year. But just in comics terms, Milton Caniff, who is sort of a giant of the comics industry, passed away this year. He was 81 years old. He did Terry and the Pirates, Dickie Dare, Steve Canyon, a book for the Army called Mail Call, MALE Call, which was essentially like a pinup and cheesecake comic strip he did for the military magazines for years. But there were a ton of the young artists that came in the 70s, 80s, that Milton Caniff was like the guy they emulated in terms of professionalism and in terms of draftsmanship. So
Gotcha.
a lot of that old stuff is fantastic. It was mostly done in comic strip form, but it still had a lot of effect on a lot of these guys.
So what is it?
Oh, go ahead.
So what does that mean for the industry then as a whole? What are we seeing as a result of all these DC titles that are, pretty crazy? You have the Black Kiss that's causing lots of censorship questions and things like that. What did this end up leading to?
Well, a number of comic distributors and comic shops actually found themselves in significant financial troubles. What was happening was that the number of titles they were seeing, first the black and white stuff in 86 and into 87, and now just the flooding the zone of Marvel and DC, was meaning that the amount of stuff they had to bring in was making it so that in many cases they weren't able to order what they needed and still be able to make payroll and pay for their shipments. And so what happened in many cases is they started having to not order the stuff that they didn't know as much would sell. And that really constricted a lot of the smaller publishers and a lot of the newer publishers. And
that makes sense.
What you have at this point is a lot of stores that are simply having to buy mostly Marvel and DC, and even at that, not be able to buy maybe everything from Marvel and DC. So you'd have to make sure that your store was ordering in some of the stuff you wanted, if it was not necessarily the really mainstream ones. Plus, we've got comic store manager, Michael Correa, actually convicted in the U.S. of what they called, quote, attempting to disseminate obscene material. This led Dennis Kitchen to actually establish the Legal Defense Fund that would lead to the comic book Legal Defense Fund being actually incorporated next year. But for this year, they did a benefit, bunch of drawings, this sort of stuff that were auctioned off. That money was used to help with his appeal. And on appeal, Correa actually was, the conviction was overturned. But by that time, he decided to just leave comics, and he gave up his job as manager and went off and did something less stressful, I would assume.
Sure.
We also had the Creators' Bill of Rights signed in Northampton, Massachusetts. This was something where Scott McCloud, Dave Sim, Kevin Eastman, a number of guys who've been doing stuff in the independent world, basically tried to come up with a contract idea or a way of thinking about working with the big companies that would allow somebody to make sure that they would keep their rights, that they would be able to actually make a decent living, all this other stuff. And it's not something that ever really became an industry standard, but a lot of parts of what they were talking about have become industry standard, or at least are things that people think about pretty strongly these days. In terms of the business, we had Diamond distributors, come on a couple of years ago, ended up purchasing Bud Plant this year. Bud Plant Distributing had done some comic books, had a number of distributors around the Midwest and the like. When they bought Bud Plant, Diamond got bigger both in terms of its overall size and its geographical footprint. Those of us who've been around through the 90s and 2000s know that Diamond is not done growing yet, but this is the point where they start to really begin absorbing others. And I think they're still a second or third biggest publisher or distributor at this point, but they'll continue to grow. Outside of that, weird news. This was the year where someone tried to kidnap Cheryl Schultz's wife. And there was a couple guys who they went in, they had a plan to kidnap Cheryl Schultz's wife and hold her for ransom and the like. And they ended up getting scared away or something foiled their plan. But nonetheless, kind of a weird thing. That
Charles Schultz, the Peanuts
guy, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Weird. That's weird. That's really weird.
Mm-hmm. So there we go. That's mostly it. It was a weird year in terms of there were a few big comics that came out. There were a lot of comics that came out from Marvel and DC, and there's a lot of people in the industry looking at the fact that things are not as stable as they'd like it.
Right. So what about awards for this year? It looks like you have the Eisner Awards that were given out for the books in 1988.
Yeah, we're kind of getting into a period where there are a bunch of awards around. I'm not going to try and deal with all of them. Now that we have the Eisner Awards, we're just going to go with the Eisner Awards. Call it good.
Sure.
And then, but the Harveys did debut this year, technically. We talked about them last year because the Harveys, given in 1988, were 4 comics in 1987. But technically, this is the first year that the Harveys came out. And then there's still a bunch of others as well. But with the Eisners now here, what they did is they gave Best Single Issue or Story to Kings in Disguise, #1. Paul Chadwick and his series Concrete won for Best Black and White Series and Best Continuing Series of any sort. Best Finite Series was Silver Surfer Parable by Stan Lee and Jean Mobius-Giraud. This is actually a very interesting one. It's essentially Stan Lee teaming up with one of the heroes of European comics to do a Silver Surfer one-shot. It's actually a really cool comic book. Best New Series, again, was Kings in Disguise. Best Graphic Album, Batman the Killing Joke. Best Writer, Alan Moore. Best Penciler, or I guess first off, Best Writer Artist was Paul Chadwick, again for his stuff with Concrete. Best Artist Pencil Inkler or Penciler Inkler Team, Brian Boland, which essentially he is his own team because he inked all of his own stuff. Best Art Team, Alan Davis and Paul Neary for Excalibur. And then they gave a humanitarian award to Phil Ye and one additional Hall of Fame award to Harvey Kurtzman. So the Hall of Fame at this point would now equal 4 instead of 3.
What is Concrete then by Paul Chadwick? Have you read that? Do you know what that is?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Concrete it's interesting because it's a story of this guy who he looks like a big block of rocks, essentially. And it's a story that's almost, there's some adventure parts to it, but it's really more almost like just him going about his day. And they're simpler, sort of more, I don't know if I'd say more innocent stories, but more down-to-earth stories.
Gotcha.
It's like slice of life superhero or something along those lines. So Concrete's difficult to understand. I should just send you some Concrete comics. Maybe that's my best plan here.
Put that on your to-do list then. Okay.
I may do that.
Before we move on and start talking about Marvel, why don't you tell us what your favorite non-Marvel comic was from 1988?
So, after I finish this, my favorite comic from 1988 was probably V for Vendetta. I really did enjoy that a lot. I was in that rebellious age. But the favorite I want to talk about, and this is more of a personal collecting history note, is that my actual comics collecting years, for the most part, spanned 1981 to 1988. So this is like the year I went to college. This was the first year that I was away from my, house and my ability to hang out and get books from my existing place. And I kind of got away from collecting physical books for a few years after this, which is weird because by going to a bigger town, I would have had access to an actual comic shop for the first time in my life, but my money went other places instead.
Sure.
In any case, there's one book, The New Teen Titans, which was later renamed to Tales of the Teen Titans, that nearly perfectly bookends my collecting history. It starts in 1981, and it starts in late 1980, November 1980, ends in 1988. And it is one of my favorite books of all time and one of my favorite books of the decade. If there's one comic book from DC that I would say this is my favorite book, it would probably be Teen Titans. I love the Legion of Superheroes, and I've got a box of Legion and I've got a box of Teen Titans. But in terms of an actual series I was collecting and that I loved, Teen Titans was something special. This was the Marv Wolfman, George Perez book that then morphed into some other guys finishing it off later.
The year in Marvel.
Excelsior!
All right, Dan, we've heard what DC was doing this year, and we got a little bit of an idea of what effect that had on the independent and smaller distributors, the comic book stores and stuff. Dare I ask what Marvel was doing this year? And I'm assuming it's something pretty similar to what DC did.
Yeah, it was a crazy year. They published 150 different titles this year at some point or another.
Whoa.
So when you think about it, there's 150 comics, different series coming out. So not all of those obviously are going to be continuing, but it's still a massive number of titles to have on the shelves. And this is the problem, is that, once they start doing limited series, they start doing some of these other things, that even if all of those 150 aren't coming out every month, they're sticking on the shelves and taking up space and making it harder for something else to find space, right?
Right.
Even so, they needed some new titles because they had some things happening this year. The new universe actually folded in on itself and ended. So we lost all our new universe titles. That actually ended in a big story called The Pit and a few other things that sort of wrapped it all up, blew up Cleveland, and closed down the universe. So that's a little bit.
So it lasted
weird, but
like 2 years, was it? 3 years?
about three or four. The interesting thing is they had a little joke actually at the end of almost all of them, because most of them started the same month and a lot of them ended the same month. And all the ones that lasted long enough, the masthead on the top, sometimes you get a limited series that says number 4 in a 4-issue miniseries or something like this. All of the new universe books for that month said number 32 in a 32-issue limited series. And then they were done. So kind of
there you go.
a little joke from the Marvel editors. So they expanded their lines all over the place into new X-Men books, new independent, like X-Men stories. There were expansions to the way the annuals worked, all of this sort of stuff. So a lot of this, for the X-Men, they had the Fall of the Mutants crossover, which had something called the Mutant Registration Act as the center of it. If you now think about like the Superhero Registration Act and everything else that's so big in the MCU and that we've seen around, this is kind of where a lot of that started.
Gotcha.
Evolutionary War is a crossover running through the Marvel annuals that year. So now what they did is the annuals, instead of having them just disconnected, now all of your annuals basically tell a story about the High Evolutionary trying to bring about sort of like a forced evolution of humanity to its next stage. And everybody's annual would have a little bit of that story. So if you wanted to get the whole High Evolutionary story, it was like its own series running through the annuals. Which, since they're all high priced, it's kind of an expensive series to collect.
Yeah.
We also had in the Marvel books Genosha debuting. Genosha is sort of the island that becomes a refuge for the mutants. Venom debuts in Spider-Man number 298 through 300. Various things we learn his origin story in 300 and the like. But so this is when we first see that black costume turn into an actual antagonist for Spider-Man after previously just sort of being considered to be like a, almost just like a, well, what did they call it? We'd known it was a, anyways.
Symbiote?
Yeah.
Is that the word you're looking for?
Yeah. So we'd known it kind of was a symbiote thing, but now it actually finds its host in Eddie Brock and becomes a full-on sort of antagonist. One of the most important parts about that is the fact that it's first drawn by Todd McFarlane. And according to him, one of the reasons why he's got this crazy big grin and everything, and Venom has that big mouth and all that, is that he didn't realize there was a person in there.
Oh.
He just thought it was like a big glob or whatever. So, which in the end has worked out pretty well because that's become a pretty distinctive part of the character.
Right.
So, Marvel also decided that, should also note, buried the lead there. This is also the year Todd McFarlane does his first Spider-Man books.
Yeah.
These are going to become incredibly expensive and sought after, and it sort of begins the godhood of Todd McFarlane that's going to result in him deciding to break up the band and head over and found Image Comics in a few years.
Okay.
We also had a split book that debuted, another one, Marvel Comics Presents. If you remember, we already have one where Hawkeye has the first story and then he alternates with somebody else for the second one. This one now is going to be a 48-page book, so a larger one, with 4 11-page stories. No notes. 36-page. You get 4 8-page stories, I think. And the interesting thing about them is they each star a different hero, and it's got a flip cover. So they alternate who gets the main cover and the back covers each time. But you essentially would have 4 stories, like there'd be a Wolverine story, and there'd be a Machine Man story, and there'd be a whatever story. And 2 of them would go one direction, and then you'd flip the comic vertically when you're done, and then you'd have a different cover, so there is no back cover to these, which as somebody who loves putting things in the right order, this has always caused trouble for me in my collection because you have to decide which cover you want out for your Marvel Comics Presents. That one, when you open it up, it then would have the other 2 stories that you would read that way. So
weird.
Kind of crazy, but it allowed them to have more pages and the like. We also saw Akira coming to America with new colors and printing techniques. Just kind of, I guess we can deal with it here. This is actually my pick of the week as far as a favorite. Akira was brought over from Japan this year. It's Katsuhiro Otomo's kind of epic story of this post-apocalyptic Japan and these weird little child mutants and everything. It's fantastic. When Marvel got it, it had been published originally in black and white. They got the rights to it. They got Steve Oliff to come in and color it. He developed entirely new ways of doing colors in comic books, basically, for this series. They retranslated it or translated it into English. They flipped the pages so that it would be read Western style, and they put it out in these sort of bookshelf perfect bound editions of 64 pages. And they are just unlike anything else you could get in American comics at this time. So fantastically beautiful and detailed. Akira essentially blew my mind in a way that nothing had since Sienkiewicz's Demon Bear came out. It was that sort of a leap where it's just, how is this even possible? So
sounds great.
It was great. It is great. Well worth reading. There's a number of these that are collections you can buy out at bookstores. You can either get them now in the Marvel editions with the Oliff coloring, or they also now have them in the original right to left black and white edition that would be more the format you'd have gotten it from Japan. Only, of course, with English text. So, you have your options.
Are any of them available in Marvel Unlimited?
No, because it's not a Marvel copyright.
Oh, okay.
They have no,
Sure.
kind of like
That makes
ElfQuest
sense.
and all the other Epic stuff. They don't have rights to it, so they
Gotcha.
and they'd have to pay to get the rights to put them in there. So they're not
Sure.
going to do that. So
Gotcha.
other than that, we had Doug Murray actually, kind of in just Marvel news, won the Veterans Achievement Award for Entertainment in 1988. This is given out by a veterans organization to someone who sort of best kind of showed the veteran experience in books or movies or whatever. And Murray and the Nom actually beat out Platoon in 1988, which that's pretty good.
Yeah, that's a pretty well known movie.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
May have
Well
won
done,
Best
Doug
Picture,
Murray.
but it couldn't beat out the Nom. So there you go.
All right. So, what about new titles this year for Marvel? You mentioned 150.
Yep.
There's obviously going to be some limited series here, but what were some of the more long-standing sort of books that ended up coming out, debuting this year?
8 of them managed to go 24 issues, 2 years or more. A couple of them had really nice runs. Wolverine debuted his standalone series, which people have been wanting for a long time. That actually went
Sure.
190 issues, about 15, 16 years. Marvel Comics Presents, which was also most of the time starring Wolverine, went 175 issues. Excalibur, which is Kitty Pryde and a lot of the mutants, like Nightcrawler's in it, etc. Actually went 126 issues, and this is a book I really love. Alan Davis's art is fantastic. Claremont writes this as a little bit more of a comedic type of book, so it's really well done. It starts out kind of dark because the idea is that Kitty and Nightcrawler think all the other X-Men are dead after the big crossover for the year, and so they go off to England to kind of start new lives and don't realize. And then the X-Men come back and don't tell them for a while, which also has always bothered me. But anyways, Doctor Strange actually had his longest running title debut this year, Doctor Strange Sorcerer Supreme, which went 90 issues. And usually if you just divide by 12, see that, that's like 8 years or whatever. Punisher War Journal, which was another title for the Punisher because he was popular enough, went 80 issues. And then we have a couple of kind of odd ones. Elf went 50 issues. And by Elf, I mean alien life form. Yep, the guy from TV. And in fact, there's even points at which there are crossovers which show that Elf potentially actually is a part of the actual Marvel universe, although those have been shown to be like dream sequences to keep people from getting grumpy. So
Sure.
Akira went 38 issues, which was essentially not that it was canceled. That's just what it took to finish Otomo's story using the format that Marvel was using. And What the actually went 26 issues. It was originally going to be a mini series, and then it was extended out into a full-on series that went for 26 issues.
Do I even dare ask what the was?
I don't know if you want to ask, but I guess we tell you.
Huh.
Do you remember Not Brand Ec from way back in the day? It was like Marvel parodying itself. This is the new version of Not Brand Ec. It's essentially a Marvel parody series that allows them to just sort of like have crazy characters and have fun with them and that sort of stuff. So it's got a lot of art by like, regular Marvel artists and like just doing goofy things. So I remember seeing the covers of them. I didn't actually read a whole lot of what does, so I don't know that much about them.
Okay. I was wondering
they
just
might
how
be in Marvel Unlimited though.
Okay. I was just wondering what sort of craziness that might be given everything else that we've heard and talked about the last couple of years. So, sure. That's not as bad as I thought it could have possibly been anyway.
No, not at all.
All right.
It's a little bit of fun.
Switching to something. Let me try this one more time. Switching to limited series is what were some of the notable or standout limited series that debuted this year?
I had a tough time really finding any. There were some that were interesting, like the Havoc and Wolverine Meltdown story, that Silver Surfer story with Stanley and Gerard is probably the big one. But
Right.
most of the other ones I looked at, they didn't really resonate that much with me. I think that there were a number of them, but it's like Amazing Adventure, Black Panther, Captain Justice, Draft, Dragon's Claws, Last of the Dragons, and The In-Call as graphic novels. And The In-Call is a reprint. Excalibur Sword is drawn. Flintstones and Friends, Inhumans graphic novel. Iron Man Crash is interesting because it's another of those digital books where it's all computer generated.
Okay.
But it was more sophisticated than Shatter, done by the same guy who'd done Shatter, which we talked about back in the early '80s.
Okay.
But it still doesn't look all that great. It was okay at best. There's just really nothing in these that really Stray Toasters maybe. It was not a great year. Not a great
Okay.
year. So, or at least for limited series. There were a bunch of them. None of them really resonated.
All right. What about new characters then? Did we see much? You mentioned Venom, so obviously Venom is pretty big.
Yeah, really, as far as this year, it's not a great year. We have Speedball, who's important because he has a pretty good run in the 90s, and then his team actually are the ones that end up having a big fight, causing a villain called Nitro to blow up most of a town, and then because everybody else is dead and he's put in prison, he's the one that ends up being sort of blamed and is the face of the registration program that becomes the heart of Civil War. So one of Marvel's biggest events, he's kind of a big figure at the beginning of. We have Venom, of course. We have Typhoid Mary, who you're going to probably talk about a little bit. And
just a little bit, yeah.
We've got the three Marys, so it's not just Typhoid Mary. There's three different elements to her. But yeah, other than that, it's people like, we get Tarantula and Tombstone and Spider-Man. We get a new Viper in Nick Fury. I don't see a whole lot of characters, though, that really are all that lasting. We get Bullet in Daredevil. I don't know that I look at him as being that big a one. Again, it's one of those where there's a lot of comics coming out, but not a lot of new characters. They're just kind of telling stories with the ones they have at this point.
Gotcha. Okay. So what about besides the limited series that come to an end this year, were there what other maybe more long-standing ones ended their run this year?
We had ElfQuest, which died a natural death because Wendy Pini had done a certain number of ElfQuest stories and Marvel reprinted them, and then the series ended. Right. Thundercats was canceled. The official handbook of the Marvel Universe, Deluxe Edition, came and went, and again, that was one that had a certain number of issues and it was going to go. Strange Tales, which had been revived, was canceled. Masters of the Universe was canceled. Spider-Man Comics Magazine, G.I. Joe Comics Magazine were canceled, as well as Star Comics Magazine and Heathcliff's Funhouse. So we're seeing a lot of licensed titles go away. We're seeing a lot of kids' titles go away. This is actually the year that the Star imprint is killed by Marvel. And so the remaining books, like Heathcliff and the like, are just going to fold into being Marvel branded, and they're going to get rid of the Star line.
Okay.
I think the idea was that they'd started to realize most of the people buying comics were not kids anyways, but there were people who were grown-ups buying Heathcliff, and they didn't want them to feel like they should, shamed because they were buying a kid's comic. And so, because there's always been a lot of comic fans who like Donald Duck or like whatever, and previously there was no particular, shame to that, past the normal shame of buying comic books. but now Marvel had started saying these are specifically for small children. Why are you reading them? And so they took that off.
All right. So let's talk about the bullpen. What if they're publishing so many titles? I have to think the staff is just actually huge.
Yeah, I think they added the new people alone were over 100 this year. And I believe that, again, looking at my sort of limited, I believe we're well over 350. So the total staff increased by probably 50 over what it was last year. Some people would have been leaving and then others coming on and that sort of stuff. We still have DeFalco as our editor-in-chief. A number of editors did change. Larry Hama and Nocenti stepped down from editing so that they could do more writing. Bob Harris, Bobby Chase, Terry Cavanaugh were promoted into editor jobs. So we had 2 editors move down and 3 move up, which makes sense because you're needing to expand that editorial staff. And then there were 2 guys who passed away this year who had significant Marvel credits we've talked about in the past. Frank Joka, which many of you have heard me almost certainly mispronouncing his names multiple times in the list of Marvel's credits over the last few years, was somebody who'd been working at Marvel for a long time. Amazing Spider-Man, Captain America, a bunch of other things. And then Jack Binder, who'd done work on Daredevil also. Binder was 86. Jacoca was only 63.
I'm going to say Binder was a name that I recognized, given that we've read some of his work. All right, so you said there's like a bunch of new people. That means we've got a lot of candidates for the Rookie of the Year. Who are some of the ones that you're going to spotlight, and then who takes home the Rookie of the Year title for 1988?
You know, the weird thing is, even though there were a bunch of new people, very few of them were folks who had a long-term sort of connection to Marvel. So some of the people who did, Ron Lim, who did a lot of work, I remember him best for a lot of his stuff with Silver Surfer. Scott Lobdell, who did a lot of work on X-Men and the like. Mark Farmer had quite a few Marvel titles here and there. The person I think I'm going to go with, though, for the actual Rookie of the Year is actually somebody who's not done that much Marvel work. Almost certain he did less actual work than anybody who's going to get a Rookie of the Year. It's partly because he's super slow, and partly because he's done a lot of stuff other places. So his name's Bryan Hitch. He is an artist, a penciler, who's worked on a number of titles over the years, independent stuff, a lot of things at Marvel UK back in the day and the like. But the reason he's getting the award is because he was the guy brought on board to help do a series called Ultimates in the early 2000s. And when he came on to do that, him and his inker, Paul Neary, essentially designed all new uniforms and essentially a look and feel for the Ultimates universe that becomes almost point for point what the MCU is going to look like. So they created essentially this down-to-earth, more very detailed, very technological sort of look at the Marvel universe and its characters that, you know, if you look at Thor in the Ultimates, that's Thor in the MCU. If you look at Iron Man in the Ultimates, it's absolutely the perfect template for Iron Man in the MCU. If you look at Captain America, in many ways, it's even his costume and like the chin strap and everything like that. It all comes directly out of Hitch and Neary's work in the Ultimates. And so really, even just for that one series, what they did is they helped to sort of crack the code for how to take Marvel superheroes and make them in a visual style that translated well to sort of like live action and believable superhero movies. And so it's weird. He didn't do a ton of stuff. He has been back every once in a while doing more things, but really just for Ultimates and the effect that's had. We're talking about your impact on the Marvel Universe. helping to build the MCU is a pretty good thing to put on your resume.
Sure. I think I remember us reading through some of that Ultimate series when we were looking at the first Avengers films, and yeah, the visual of those books I remember being very note for note, felt very similar to everything that I had seen in the MCU. It was felt very familiar. Let's just put it that way. And a compliment to Bryan Hitch on that, and being our Rookie of the Year for 1988. Was there anything else you wanted to mention about Akira as your favorite Marvel book this year, or should we move on and talk about Daredevil?
Only other thing to note is that the movie is also really interesting and very cool and very visually interesting. So if you haven't read the Marvel comics, if you haven't seen the movie, they are super violent and somewhat disturbing, but they're fantastic. So this is not easy reading, but it is really, really impressive, and it looks so cool. And in fact, I do think that the right way to read Akira is the Marvel, at least for folks who are used to the visual sense of American Western comics. Steve Oliff's work, the way Marvel recolored and redid these books, is absolutely fantastic. So I have actually reread a couple of the volumes in the right to left re-releases, the black and white ones, and I really do like the Marvel version. Don't tell anybody though, because that's probably heretical and is going to get me thrown off the internet. So.
You're not hipster enough then if you don't like the original black and white right to left.
I do like them, but I like the Marvel ones more. So
there you go. Okay, let's jump in and let's talk about Daredevil. The year in Daredevil.
All right, Dwayne. So, got a bunch of things that Daredevil kind of jumped around this year. He was in a bunch of other books and the like. But as far as our main comic, I have to tell you, just looking at this, I'm more hopeful than I've been in a while. Because how many writers do we have this year?
We have one writer.
How many pencilers do we have? We
have one penciler.
And how many inkers?
We have one inker. So
tell me about this year. I'm very confident this is a good sign.
This is, in fact, a very good sign. Let's talk about the year in Daredevil. It is Daredevil. The main book is issues 250 to 261. As you pointed out, he made a ton of appearances outside of this work, but this work is definitely something we're going to spend the time talking about today. West Coast Avengers 28, Thor 392, Amazing Spider-Man Annual 22, Marvel Masterwork number 5, Punisher War Journal number 2, along with the Daredevil Punisher Child's Play graphic novel and the Hawkeye graphic novel. He makes an appearance. As far as who those writing, penciling, and inking credits go to, and Nocenti, who started in and basically did a lot of work writing last year, continued on, did the entire set of books. We have a new artist, John Romita Jr., and I love the work. I actually just loved the work. These two seem to work together really well. Al Williamson did the ink across all of these books, and we talked about last year there just being sort of just this kind of spin the wheels and you're just kind of just going for a year. That wasn't the case this year. There was a really good story that comes up in the second half of the year, but let's jump in and let's talk about where we begin the year, which is with the new artist, John Romita Jr., and a new villain called Bullet, who you mentioned, who's been hired by the Calco Chemical Company, as we see the continuation of that Tyrone Jansen story from late last year. He was the kid that got blinded by Calco Chemicals dumping in a lake or a river, and the kid got blinded by those chemicals. We also meet Bullet's son, Lance, who is afraid the world's going to end at any moment, thanks to a rather shocking description of World War by his teacher at the beginning of,
that teacher,
of the book. That was some pretty scary stuff. He's like got the the projector on, and he's just I envision the sort of the monotone Ben Stein sort of description of terror, disgusting terror, bombs, bodies everywhere, and just flashing through these just horrific image after horrific image. And it's like a bunch of 10-year-old kids that are looking at this, and it's just crazy.
Dead cows and devastation, and
yes,
it was not good.
This little it actually goes on for like 2 or 3 pages, and then at the end, like the bell rings, all the kids run off, and here's poor Lance just sitting in his seat, just trembling as to what he just saw. And then across the rest of the year, we see that he's like building a bomb shelter, and he's like stocking up on food and like different like duct tape and razor wire and all this sort of stuff, because he thinks the world's going to end basically at any moment. So thanks, teacher.
Yeah.
After that, we get another new villain, Ammo, and the Wild Boys during a blackout caused by the Apocalypse's Horsemen, which is part of the Fall of the Mutants event that was going on at the time. Again, you just sort of fall into an event and don't really know exactly what's going on. Daredevil ends up stopping Ammo, and he ends up in prison. So it was just that one issue, unlike last year where I think it crossed a couple different issues, the big crossover event. So this was, and this story felt pretty self-contained. So it wasn't really, it didn't really feel like had been missing out on a whole bunch of information to really understand what story was presented right there in front of me this time, which was nice. Yep. I'm getting jaded by these actually a little bit now, Dad. I don't know if that's
nothing wrong with that.
Okay. All right.
It is also key to keep in mind that what you've been doing, like reading an entire history of a book at this accelerated pace, makes the inconsistencies probably far more like galling and apparent. Normally it would have taken somebody 25 years to have read the Daredevil books that we've read in the last 25 weeks, and so you just wouldn't be watching for all of this as much. So
right.
But yeah, so like it is so much nicer this year, even just that things continue to connect and you're not constantly lost, as opposed to last year when, and I'm not sure that half the people who wrote one issue had read what the people who did the previous one were even saying,
Right.
It was just nuts. So
next we get to meet kind of the big character of the year. And I don't know exactly how to bring this up. After being robbed several times, Kingpin hires the robber by offering what I think, based now, after we've done a whole bunch of reading about Moon Knight, I think Typhoid Mary is a dissociative identity disorder. Would that be a fair statement to say?
I believe so, yeah. I think that's correct. That essentially there's 3 people inside her, and they are very different. So
yes. So the robber is Typhoid and has been knocking over Kingpin's stash houses throughout the city, and he offers her $1 million to make Matt Murdock, which is Daredevil, who he knows is Daredevil, fall in love with her and then crush him. And she, of course, agrees. And then at that end of that issue, we see Matt Murdock meeting one of the other alters, a beautiful young woman by the name of Mary. And what follows is a brilliant story arc that lasts basically through the end of the year. We see Murdock falling in love with Mary, and he ends up fighting typhoid several times throughout this year as well. But he never makes the connection that these two individuals are the same person, or that he's interacting with the same kind of person throughout all of this. So it's really something. I was shocked at how great this story was, and we're going to be spotlighting actually the kind of the culmination of this story arc in our spotlight this week. Dan, what do you think of the Typhoid Mary character? Because I thought she was introduced really well, and to have her then come under the as a hired hand for the Kingpin didn't exactly surprise me. But she's almost like he offers her $1 million to do this, but she's like, I'll do this for free. This sounds like fun. This sounds great. And yeah, this seemed like a really cool character, and I was like, oh god, this is going to be a ride.
Well, you were not wrong about that. Typhoid Mary has one of the craziest arcs in all of Daredevil. Like, you're not going to just see her this year. Let's put it that way. This is going to be a character that you'll want to take notes on. You're also going to need like cross-referencing and all sorts of things. Because
sure,
so many things happen with Mary over the years. But it is interesting to see where she starts and how you immediately sort of start seeing some of the things fall into place that are going to become important. So I'm going to mostly try and just shut up about this character for the next little while. I will admit that when I first started reading too, I'm not sure I really liked Typhoid Mary. Partly because I was not a big fan at the time of some of these books. Like when they first came out, I was reading them, and I don't know why, but at that time, after some of his X-Men stuff and some other stuff, I was not a Romita Jr. fan, like a big fan of him. Now looking back at it, I'm like, this art is so clean, and it tells the story so well. And
right.
I think that I was just a George Perez kid, where I'm like, I like everybody very sleek and beautiful, and everything is classical Greek proportions, and that is not him. His people are blocks, kind of, and a lot of his character design is very straightforward and linear. But yeah, going back on it now, I'm like, oh man, he really was a storyteller.
Yeah, I love the art because it felt to me like there was just like the right amount of art, if that makes any sense. There was no wasted energy across any of these pages. You could clearly tell who people were. You could clearly tell whether it was Typhoid or Mary that you were seeing. There was just, I liked the way Matt Murdock and Daredevil looked across all these books. Kingpin looks menacing across these books as well. And I don't know, the story I feel like really elevated this year, and Nocenti, I think, found her voice and did a really good job, kind of pared back on the actual word usage across these books, let the images do more of the talking, and the images across these books, all the panels seem to use just the right amount of stuff in them to really help you understand what was going on, and didn't give you anything to like, I don't get what's going on here, that sort of thing.
He definitely is interesting in that many of the pages don't have any backgrounds. He uses solid colors, or if there is a background, it's sketched. But then occasionally when he does a full page or wants to show you that, then it pops out and there is a full like rendered background with depth and everything.
Yeah.
And it just sort of makes it pop more. So
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because
I
it's far more structured than I had given it credit for back when I first read these. And now I'm going back and starting to really appreciate more why Romita Jr. has been somebody so many people really like.
It seemed to, if I remember right, Dan, when there's a lot of the action scenes when they're fighting and stuff, that's definitely a time where he tends to have just the solid backgrounds, right?
Yep.
If I remember right.
Solid or like hatchwork backgrounds or things.
Yeah.
And then you just have the figures in the forefront.
And so it just kind of shines a spotlight on that action. And there's just a great amount of detail there, so you can see exactly what's going on. You're not distracted by anything else. And to your point, when there are backgrounds in there, they really do then kind of pop off the page a little bit too.
No.
So regarding this main arc, there was some subplots that were going on throughout this arc that we should keep note of. Tyrone Jansen does get his day in court with Kelco Chemicals, whom, strangely enough, is represented by Foggy Nelson. He got hired on, and Kelco Chemicals, by the way, is a shell company for the Kingpin. So the Kingpin ends up getting him hired on, Foggy Nelson, to Kelco Chemicals, and he goes and represents him in this lawsuit. And there was some discussion around whether or not, this is the type of, case that Foggy should be on when with Gloriana across this as well. But Jansen ends up winning thanks to some ghost lawyering help from Matt Murdock and the clinic, because, of course, he can't stay away from lawyering at least a little bit. Karen Page realizes she's losing Matt Murdock because we see him sneaking around a lot to meet Mary as those two are falling in love. And we actually see the Fat Boys, who we mentioned last week, those group of kids from Hell's Kitchen. A member or two of them actually kind of see what's going on with Matt Murdock and Mary, and that doesn't go over too well either. I think one of the kids said, I don't like her. I hate Matt Murdock now as a result of this. We had Typhoid growing concerned that Mary's love for Matt is allowing her to get stronger and could eventually take over on a more permanent basis. And she didn't really like that, liked being in control and kind of coming up to the surface and taking over whenever she wanted. And then lastly, as if this wasn't complicated enough, the Kingpin falls in love with Typhoid and eventually becomes jealous of the Murdock and Mary relationship. So after he becomes jealous, he sort of orders Typhoid to get on with this whole crushing my arch nemesis sort of situation. So in doing so, she decides to assemble a team of people to help her take out Daredevil. She grabs bullets, ammo, the Wild Boys, and Bushwhacker to soften him up before she finishes the job. And that particular issue, that climax issue, is going to be our spotlight for this week. It is a fantastic, just bloodbath, nonstop action episode issue that we're going to talk about in great detail. Definitely worth it.
A fantastic bloodbath. All right.
Yeah. And then as the year ends, Daredevil is missing, and Johnny Storm, a.k.a. the Human Torch, has been enlisted to help a desperate Karen Page find him. Meanwhile, Kingpin isn't exactly happy with how Typhoid carried out his order, but now sees it as an opportunity to expand into Hell's Kitchen. So we're not exactly sure what's going on with Daredevil as the year ends, and we're going to get into why that is here in just a few moments. Dan, I loved this year. As much as I loved Daredevil Born Again in 1986 and how much I was sort of underwhelmed, let's put it, by the books in 1987. I think they came back with a really strong year, both from a storytelling standpoint, and then we've talked about John Romita's art with Al Williamson's inks. I just thought it looked great, and this was a good year for Daredevil.
Yeah, it's interesting how we will see this as we go along. When Daredevil is at his high, really, really great, like some of the best comics made that year. When he's at his low, he can just be a C. It can just be a mess, and we go back and forth between that every once in a while. It is interesting that, and I know we can talk about this more when we get into the spotlight. I think the thing that initially, because reading these again, I have been re-examining because I didn't like them originally, and I didn't necessarily know why. But I think that Typhoid Mary's costume design never really worked for me. I didn't like it. I still don't like it, but I've gotten over it. And I think that colored some of it. I've never really liked the design of Romita Jr.'s costumes. I don't like the way he makes costume design. He does a great job of using existing costume design, but when he designs them, they all sort of look like the Beyonder to me. Just some guy with a jacket flap or something. And so, I don't know. I was not loving that. But yeah, now looking at them, and Williamson, of course, is a professional's professional. Like, this guy's been at it for a long time. And so probably a lot of it too is that he does such a good job of just keeping everything clean and making sure that all of the detail and the line weights and everything are perfect. So if you are a relatively young artist, and Romita Jr. is still relatively young at this point, you really can't ask for anything better than to have Al Williamson inking you, probably. So but yeah, that consistency of 12 stories that are written by one voice and 12 issues that are drawn by the same people. Man, this was nice. Really nice.
Yeah. As far as the what's new, all this took place in New York, so there wasn't really much in the way of new locations, no new enhancements to the Billy Club or anything like that. As far as interesting supporting characters that I think we should talk about, Lance, the young boy of the son of Bullet. He's obsessed with the world ending, and he comes back frequently throughout this year. And there's a character, Rip, who is Typhoid's right-hand man when she's knocking over all of Kingpin's stash houses and kind of is in the room when Typhoid's talking with Kingpin and throughout these stories as well.
Mm-hmm.
As far as villains, we had Bullet, who is Lance's father, former government agent. We have Ammo, who's raiding a government armory and then assists Typhoid Mary in taking out Daredevil. We have the Wild Boys, Spit and Jet. These are some street brawlers who worked for Ammo in his attempt to take over an armory. And then we have Typhoid Mary, the DID system, who is hired by the Kingpin to take out Daredevil and Murdock, which becomes that focal story of the year. So I didn't know before this year, like I had heard of Typhoid Mary, but I did not know much about Typhoid Mary. And I really think this is a cool character. And I'm excited that not just for this story, but I'm excited to see what this character has in store for her going forward.
And of course, Typhoid Mary is a Marvel character. This is also an actual historical figure, because there was the Mary who was actually I don't know, she was like a cook or something like that was accused of spreading the typhoid disease across an entire city back in the day. So that's kind of what she's named after. So if you've heard the name Typhoid Mary before, but don't remember ever seeing a comic on it, it's probably because it's actually a historical reference as well. So. Hey there, everyone. This is Dan from the Editing Bay, coming at you with a quick apology for the fact that eagle-eared listeners among you may have noticed that we didn't talk at all about Daredevil number 258. It is an oddity in that in a year where otherwise all the stories were done by Ann Nocenti and the art team of Romita Jr. and Williamson, this was a fill-in issue done by Fabian Nicieza, Ron Lim, and Jim Sanders. Colors by Bob Sharon, letters by Dan Albers. So it's the first appearance of a character called Bengal, and is something that's completely outside of the regular storyline. Dwayne evidently just sort of didn't even have it register on him, which I think makes some sense, because it's not a story that's going to exactly, last a long time in memory. But did want to just mention that in actual fact, there was one book this year that was not by our main team, and that essentially we didn't talk about it. So apologies to Nicieza, Lim, and company, but in actual fact, we didn't miss much, because once again, the story really just goes from 257 to 259 as though there was nothing in between, but evidently they had some deadline problems and the like and needed a fill-in story. So with that, I'm going to send you back to our regularly scheduled program, where we're now getting started on the Spotlight story.
This week's Spotlight story.
All right, Dwayne. For the Spotlight, this year, you're turning the spotlight on the second to last issue of the year, Daredevil 260, Vital Signs, from November of 1988. What was it about this one, other than the fact that it was, the story the whole year has been building toward, that made you decide this was going to be your Spotlight story?
The cover has a note, "The Final Triumph of Typhoid Mary." It's a giant-sized issue. And we knew that she had amassed a team of villains to go after our man Matt Murdock and Daredevil. I don't see how I could pick anything else than this book as we're going through, because I think this actually does a pretty good job of kind of giving you a microcosm of what the year was like for him, because we have this really great story that's been building up all throughout this year, and then we get our socks blown off, and we're now questioning what's going to happen to Daredevil going forward as this issue ends. But let's talk about this. So this giant-sized book opens with Karen and Matt talking in the kitchen while Karen is putting away some groceries. We learn Daredevil intends to watch over an anti-nuke rally to ensure nothing bad happens. But upon leaving the house, he's immediately attacked by Bullet, who causes the pair to destroy a water tower. So he's like doing his patented, flying through the air with the billy club, and gets just knocked out of the sky basically by Bullet, who's got this like ability to kind of, I think he's got like a jetpack or something, and is flying around like a bullet. And basically he grabs him and they bowl into a water tower.
Yep. Sounds about right. I don't know if he even needs a jetpack. I think he just jumped into him or something like that.
Yeah.
And then they destroyed all sorts of stuff.
Yeah. So after continuing to battle on the roof of a nearby building, Bullet is kicked off the building and crashes onto a parked car near those anti-nuke protesters. Their battle continues on the street over the objection of the protesters until Bullet is knocked out, which is when Bushwhacker arrives on a motorcycle. So it is literally just action from the word go. Bullet fighting for a few pages, finally gets subdued and put down and knocked out because he gets thrown basically through a building wall. And then no sooner than that ends, we have another one of Typhoid Mary's team members show up, and we're going to have the fighting commence once again. It is literally just nonstop action.
Well, it's kind of ridiculous because he shows up on a motorcycle, but he's like bandaged head to toe. It's like the guy has just come out of traction or something, and he's riding a motorcycle, shooting like, automatic weapons at Daredevil or something like this. Said he escaped the prison hospital.
Yeah, well, yeah, Bushwhacker, he's the one that had the gun for the arm, right? If I remember right.
Yes. Yep.
Yes. So yeah, he he seems fun. Let's just put it that way.
Yep. He doesn't have his gun anymore though now because he's using like a he had a regular gun and then he's using like a flamethrower. So
Okay.
he's got all sorts of stuff. So
All right.
and then yeah. Oh no, never mind. Yeah. He went back to his gun arm later. So yeah, he's still shooting from his weird.
Yeah, I think
because his hand can become a gun.
Yes, his hand can become a gun. So
yes.
All right. So as we continue, Daredevil lures Bushwhacker away from the protesters and onto another roof before jumping off the roof to escape Bushwhacker's gun arm. He lands on this giant balloon being used by the anti-nuke protesters. It pops, which causes the protesters to believe they're being attacked, and they all start to scatter. Disoriented from the brawls with, two villains falling off a popped balloon, everything, Daredevil starts aggressively questioning a blind man on the street before a woman convinces him that man is not Bushwhacker, who he had been previously fighting. And as he slowly turns and walks away from the man, ammo pops out from a nearby doorway and attacks Daredevil right at the corner where the remaining anti-nuke protesters meet up with a 4th of July parade that is also going on in tandem. And Ammo makes quick work of Daredevil, who passes out on the street while the parade and the protesters start fighting as well. So you just have this just epically large Braveheart sort of fight, Game of Thrones fight in the field, right at this intersection of two streets with two different groups that are like kind of at odds with each other. And oh my goodness, this was just actually just sort of kind of over the top crazy, but in a really cool sort of way.
And I think the introduction of both of the last two villains has been like double page spreads. So they're doing a lot, I mean, a double sized issue, but they're also doing a lot of very large imaging type stuff and things like that to kind of take advantage of that too. So
yeah, it's definitely feels like a spectacle at this point. You see why it's a giant sized issue, and you're just like, okay, what could possibly happen next? All right, so what happens next when Daredevil comes to? The street is empty, and Daredevil crawls into a nearby alley where he sees a hallucination of his father battling Jack Murdock. I didn't see this coming, but of course, this makes perfect sense. He's upset with Matt because he's fighting, and then he sees other hallucinations as well. We see Bullseye, we see Gladiator, we see Elektra. We even see some of the people he's currently kind of up against, right? In Typhoid and the Kingpin, all who seem to be bent on Daredevil's demise. And so what does Daredevil do? He starts swinging wildly at these hallucinations, and he's just kind of out of it and ends up getting knocked into a wall by a real punch from Spit of the Wild Boys, the last of the super team that Typhoid Mary has put together to soften up Daredevil. They continue to beat on Daredevil through the streets until ending up on a bridge. Now hanging off the bridge, Spit's about ready to step on his hand and make him fall, but Typhoid intervenes actually just before Jet is going to cause Daredevil to fall. So yeah, she really does want to be the one that takes the finishing blow. So she actually like threatens him with like a sword and says, no, this wasn't what you were supposed to do. You were getting him ready for me. it's my turn now. So all the team members have done their job, and now he's hanging off a bridge, and Typhoid's there to finish the deal.
Yeah.
I'm like,
this is
so bad. This is so bad. And here's where it gets interesting, because as the story ends, Daredevil starts begging for help from Typhoid and asks, quote, "Why? Must you kill me? You don't even know me." To which Typhoid replies, "Oh, but I do. I do, my sweetheart. I have to kill you. I love you," before sending him falling to the ground below as tears start streaming down her face. So you can tell that Mary has a little bit of control and understands exactly what is going on throughout all this.
Yeah.
Just a crushing end to this story.
Mm-hmm. And then the next issue's weird because it's really a story pretty much without Matt Murdock in it. He literally just sort of lays in the grass for the entirety of the next issue. So as far as the end of the season, the end of the year, this one pretty much ends it for Daredevil.
Yeah, because
nobody knows where go on without him.
Yeah, nobody knows where he is. The only person that does know where he is Mary, Typhoid, and they aren't saying anything, at least not right away. So I thought this was a fantastic kind of conclusion to this story arc that we were building throughout the year. And the Typhoid Mary character was so interesting through all this. I loved the fact that we had Kingpin, who kind of, he was still plotting over everything that happened during Born Again and was like, I'm going to get my revenge. And yeah, this seems like a really good way to get revenge on your nemesis.
Yeah. It's a weird start to things, but I like the fact too that I think what you find in this is all the stuff that made the Nocenti run so cool. It's very ground level, it's psychological, it's playing around with a lot of sort of stuff inside Daredevil's head. It's also weird that, I don't know if you noticed, but Thought Bubbles made a return. She's more of a classic writer where she likes to have some thought bubbles to be able to say what's going on in people's head. And like Frank Miller had kind of left a lot of those behind, and a lot of the other writers now, because of Alan Moore and because of Miller, are starting to kind of get out of people's heads and do fewer thought bubbles. But she kind of returned a lot of that. So we've got a lot more inner monologue sort of stuff going. And these are really solid, interesting stories and very complex because you've got so many moving parts. Although I will say this one was really an awful lot of punching.
Yeah, this particular issue was just like, nonstop, just fists are punching throughout this.
It's like watching a ball bounce around New York City, just a little Super Ball, but the Super Ball is actually Daredevil just being punched and kicked and hit from one part of the city to another until eventually he falls off a bridge and lays in the grass.
Yeah.
And that's the end. So.
Yep.
Oh.
So yeah, I got through this issue and I was just like, breath was sort of taken away. I immediately read the next issue to try and find out what was going on with Daredevil, how long it was going to take to find him. And as you said, the issue ends and they still don't know where he is. And, he's fallen from a high place. He is like bleeding out in this like little grassy area underneath a bridge in New York City somewhere. And they just have to somehow find him. And this was some issue. I love the fact that this was a giant issue and we got to see just so much action going on and all this. And yeah, this felt like a special issue, and I definitely felt like this is the one that we needed to highlight this week.
There you go. And I will note, by the way, again, for those who maybe aren't familiar with his previous stuff, Al Williamson as your inker is astonishing. When you talk about this guy, he was born in the 1930s. He actually worked for EC Comics, doing a lot of like their weird science fiction stuff in the 50s. So when we talk about people like, Frank Miller talking about some of these comics that they idolized, Williamson drew those comics. So he was like a legend to a lot of the guys from this age. And even into the 80s, he was doing a lot of comic strip stuff, writing or drawing for Marvel, and like he drew a lot of the film adaptations. And so that's the other reason why I think I really do like this art, is that Williamson himself, just so good. It's kind of one of those things. This is the way all comic books should be done with younger creators, because Nocenti's just starting as a writer. Romita Jr.'s had a couple of years, but he's still relatively young. When you take just a guy who makes everything he touches look beautiful, and you make him the last part of the process, and it works, It
does.
I don't know why Williamson has ever made a bad-looking comic book page, and so it's pretty cool.
All right, I think we've covered the spotlight for this week, Dan. Let's move in and let's talk about the takeaway to wrap things up for this week. This week's takeaway. Hey, we had a lot to talk about this week, Dan. DC Marvel are just running on all cylinders, flooding the market with comics. We have all these smaller chains that are having trouble keeping up with everything that is on the market. You've got there's so much here. What is the takeaway for this week?
Well, I mean, it's an exciting year in comics still, because there's a lot going on. Whether I liked it or not, a lot of people loved Killing Joke. There was a lot of excitement over the whole, it's Superman's birthday and Robin dies, and over at Marvel, you've got all of these comics coming out and really interesting stuff going on in X-Men and going on in Punisher and new Wolverine comics and everything. Even in the, independent books, a lot of them, Cerebus rolls on, Love and Rockets rolls on. There's books by Viz, like I was reading something called like Area 88. So you're starting to see some manga coming over, or manga-inspired books. A lot of the other smaller publishers are still trying to get their stuff out there. But the problem is Pacific First, Comico, all these sort of what would have been mid-major books are just getting squeezed right now. And the problem is, with Marvel and DC having the amount of stuff coming out that they are, we're seeing that the chain is just backing up. Part of the problem is that a lot of these places still are trying to recover from the fact they bought too many black and white books in 1986 and 1987. Now they're just unable to keep up with the flood coming from Marvel and DC. And I think what's happening is that you're seeing two companies that simply are not managing the ecosystem that they're essentially in charge of. Marvel wants to take over being the one that leads the world of comics. They've got to be responsible with that. And right now they're not being responsible. And both of these companies are bringing out a lot of stuff, trying a lot of stuff. There's nothing wrong with that. But they're not really interfacing with their customers and with the middlemen. And a lot of the problems we're going to be seeing in the late 80s and into the 90s, you can sort of start to see happen here, because the comic book supply chain is incredibly vulnerable. You have a bunch of distributors that are not making a lot of money and are taking almost everything on credit. And you have a bunch of comic book retailers who generally are not wealthy enough to take a whole lot of, hits. And because of the fact they're buying direct and paying for everything and can't return it if something doesn't sell, they're taking massive risks in terms of their inventory. Any misstep can make this entire chain sort of fall. And so it didn't happen in 88, but it did seem like there were warning signs where a number of the people who were watching this were like, this is really looking bad right now. And if we push just a little bit, the whole thing's going to fall over.
It does sort of seem like it's a house of cards that is very precariously set up on a table, and it just needs a bump, and things could get really bad really fast.
No. Which may be a way of describing the entire comic book industry, at least from 1988 to the present. Maybe even farther than that, even back in the 70s and the like, they had a lot of things. But now that the chain is so specialized, it so depends on these particular stores and on these markets. If a supermarket doesn't make money on comic books for a few months, it literally doesn't care. If a comic book store can't sell comic books for a few months, it's in big trouble.
I was going to say, this doesn't seem like the situation that could have occurred when we weren't talking about comic book stores and distributors the way we are talking about them now. When it was a magazine rack in a supermarket, it seems like, if they don't sell, well, okay, that's fine. We probably made it up on any one of a number of other things that we sell in the supermarket, and it's not that huge a deal.
And the thing is that at that point, the risk was all on the publisher. Because if the publisher put out a bunch of books that didn't sell to the customers, they got them all back, right? Because it was all returnable.
Sure.
Now,
that's right.
If you put out a bunch of books that don't sell to the customer, but for whatever reason your supply chain trusts you enough to buy them, you made tons of money. Everybody that you sold to is stuck.
And they're going to definitely be gun shy going forward too.
Yes, and that's the problem, is that Marvel and DC have to realize that just because they're making their money, they maybe have to be a little more careful. And this is something they've got to adapt to, because we're just now getting to the point where we're pretty much completely leaving the newsstand, and it's all about protecting and managing this ecosystem. And they haven't yet really learned what to do with that, it doesn't seem. But anyway, so we'll watch that. The economic side of comics comes to the fore a little bit in seeing what we're going to find here.
This seems like a rather ominous message to what could be coming soonish, possibly.
Yeah. But there's no use to worry about it, because basically there's an ominous message coming for comic books every year since like 1937. And yet it seems that the next year there's still comic books. So the one thing I can tell you is every year when I bitch about the fact that comic books appear to be on the verge of dying, the next year we'll come back and talk about comic books. So
there is that, yes.
It is it's basically a hobby of my kind, is that people who've been with comics for more than a couple of decades are constantly expecting them to implode. And they don't, because there's talented, cool people making interesting stuff, and art finds a way to survive. And we go.
That is a good takeaway for this week. That's going to put a wrap on this week's show. We'd like to thank you for joining us. If you're new to the podcast, please consider subscribing on your podcast player of choice. That way you'll get each new episode as soon as it's released. If you've already subscribed, we'd appreciate it if you'd share the show via social media or leave us a review. That will help new listeners find the show much easier. Whether you're new to the podcast or you've been with us from the beginning, we'd love to get your thoughts about this week's show. You can send those to us via email at comments@comicsovertime.com or via Twitter or Blue Sky. We're @comicsovertime there. Until next week, take care, everybody.